Good morning.
Morning.
It is 10:01 on October 24th, and I am going to call the regular meeting of the Denton County Transportation Board of Directors to order. This morning, we have Chair Gilmore, who is not in attendance. So we have Kristen Green from our alternate, who will be in this place. I'm Vice Chair Molina, and I will be running the meeting today. So our first act would be to do our invocation. Secretary Eads, would you mind doing the invocation?
Sure. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this day, and thank you for the fact that we live in America and we have the wonderful form of self-government. And thank you for the opportunity to be here and participate in that form of government. I pray that as we go through this election season, this important time in the life of our county and our state and our country, that we be tolerant of other people, we be kind to one another, and that once this election is over, that a spirit of unity come over our country. In your name I pray, amen.
Amen. Please join me now in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now the Texas flag. Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state under God, one and indivisible. Thank you. Okay, our next item is introductions. I mentioned about our chair. Mr. Crescino, do we have any introductions from staff?
Just thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the board would like to acknowledge that Ms. Lisa Taylor is joining us now in the room in her role as Vice President of Operations. We appreciate her being here with us today and congratulate her for her new role. So thank you, sir.
Welcome. All right, moving on. Our next item is public comments. This agenda item provides an opportunity for citizens to address the board of directors on any agenda items or other matters relating to the DCTA. Anyone wishing to speak shall be courteous and cordial. Speakers making personal, impertinent, profane, or slanderous remarks may be removed from the meeting. Unauthorized remarks from the audience, stamping of feet, whistles, yells, clapping, and similar demonstrations will not be permitted. Citizens that are not able to connect to the Zoom meeting must have emailed his or her comments to Ms. Keisha Morris Perkins at dca.net no later than 3 p.m. on Wednesday, October 23rd, to ensure that comments will be distributed to the board members prior to the meeting. The board of directors is not permitted to take action on any subject raised by the speaker during public comments. However, the board of directors may have the item placed on a future agenda for action, refer the item to DCTA administration for the studies or action, briefly state the existing DCTA policy, or provide a brief statement of factual information in response to inquiry. At that, I will ask Ms. Perkins, do we have any comments? Oh, no. Okay. Thank you. I will close the public comments. Moving on, we will go to our next item, which is the consent agenda. These are items that are typically non-controversial and are usually taken as a whole. Is there anyone that wishes to look at any one agenda item, pull it individually, or is there a motion to take them all as one?
I move approval of the consent agenda as presented.
We have a motion to approve the consent agenda as presented. Is there a second?
Second.
Have a motion. I have a second. Is there any further discussion? If not, I'll take a vote. All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? The motion carries. Moving on. Our next item is the regular agenda. First item is discuss and consider approval of the state agenda. Today we have presenters Drew Campbell, Byron Campbell, and Brandy Bird. I will ask them to please come up. And Mr. Christina, is there anything you want to tee up?
No, sir. We appreciate our except to say we appreciate our partners from Capital Insights and Bird Advocacy being here with us. We gave this briefing to you all last month and received comment, and now the intent of this item is for the board to adopt the proposed agenda or make comments to revise it so that we can prepare for the upcoming legislative session. So thank you all for being here today, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members, appreciate being here today. Primarily what we're here to do today, again, is to approve our agenda that we talked about last month and to answer any questions that you may have going forward. And that we obviously have a very aggressive agenda that we're going to try to accomplish between now and the time the session starts. I know everybody's aware that November 5th, we've got an election coming up, which may or may not change some of the things that are going on in Austin. But obviously we've got a lot of work in front of us. We're going to have a lot of new freshman members of the House here. We're still not sure what the House configuration is going to look like because there will be a very aggressive speakers race. And so that could turn and change some things around, but we'll see what happens. But with that, Mr. Chairman, we're open for any questions, comments, thoughts.
Any questions, discussions from the board on the 5 items that are presented here by Mr. Campbell?
And again, our whole thrust in this is education and make sure we differentiate DCTA and our success here with our partners, city partners, and the success that we're having in terms of the number of people who are in our ridership and of course the outreach that Paul Christine and his staff do with our city members.
I'd like to thank y'all for walking us through this over the last couple of months. And I believe, legislative agendas and related items, I believe less is more. We've talked about that. I know that's y'all's philosophy as well. Less is, and so I think that we're handling this in the appropriate manner. Is this the exact language that we're using? This is on the PowerPoint. Is this exact?
Yes, sir.
This is exact. Okay. I didn't know it was a condensed version of a longer narrative.
And obviously, as I like to tell people, in politics, there's lightning bolts. There's things that happen that you don't anticipate. No one could predict. And I think a good example of that is what happened last week with the death penalty issue that popped up that just came out of left field. Nobody expected it. Now you've seen a lot of activity down there. Obviously, that has nothing to do with us. But the reality is that we need to be prepared on the ground. And that's why we want to do the education, the meeting and greeting with the members of the legislature, so that if any issue that will affect us comes forward, we're ready to hit it head on immediately. And of course, we'll do that in consultation with Paul and his staff, and then of course the board as well.
Drew, if I may, one thing that I would highlight here, and that is in item 2, with regard to crossing eliminations, grade separations on the A-train corridor / in Carrollton, that obviously would require the specific locations where that might happen would require us to be in consultation with the city of Carrollton. And we would want to make sure that anything that we put forward for specific projects is certainly considerate of and deferential to the plans they have for those crossings in their city. So with that component of that item is going to be in development over the course of the next several months. So, thank you.
Any other comments on this particular item? If not, Mr. Campbell, your staff, Ms. Bird, thank you so much for.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We look forward to working through the session.
So this is an action item, so there is going to be a need for us to formally approve this. So I'll entertain a motion from anyone.
I move approval.
We have a motion. Is there a second?
My second.
We have a motion. We have a second. All in favor of approving the legislative agenda for this coming year, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Motion carries. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Moving on, our next agenda item will be the update on the member and contract services policy. Mr. Christina is going to run this one. So I will turn it over to Mr. Christina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. And if I may, just to point out that this is for covering regular agenda items 2 and 3 simultaneously, because They are interrelated as we talk about an update on our new member and contracted services policy alongside the opportunity for technology-based transit service in the city of Frisco.
Okay.
This is a discussion item only today, and really we are continuing a conversation that we've had about the city of Frisco service opportunity for several months, as well as back in January in the strategic workshop regarding the model for financial engagement with non-member cities on these types of services. So just as a refresher, when we're talking about Frisco Go Zone service, what we are talking about is a Go Zone service that would cover the portion of the city of Frisco that's outlined in the dotted purple line. That consists of the central business district of the city of Frisco along the Dallas North Tollway and Preston Road, and then taking that turn to the west out to Frisco Lakes. We talked about how our staff has worked extensively with VIA and the city of Frisco for the better part of the last year and change in order to identify what is the capacity required for that system. And where the analysis landed from VIA and where DCTA ultimately ended up were slightly different, but I believe that the solution makes the most sense. It provides us the flexibility to respond to what we think the real demand of the service could be, as well as what we expect the productivity of every vehicle that's put on the road, what that could be. So if we assume that the productivity of a Go Zone vehicle in Frisco is similar to what we see in Louisville and Highland Village, we're at about 3.8 trips per hour. That's a fleet of about 18. If we plan for 20 vehicles operating 12 hours a day over the course of the year, then you see the cost of the service at 2.7 million, the 60% administrative fee, which is DCTA's policy for contracted services historically, and then the total cost of the service being $4.34 million. So these are the numbers that are now feeding into this financial model that I'm going to share with you. And then we briefed this item back in August, I believe. We talked about the need to, as we're developing this contracted service policy, we need to answer questions about why are we doing contracted services as an agency based on our mission statement and how we exist to serve Denton County and our member cities. And where we landed in that presentation was really 4 policy questions around contracted services that you see here. And the board gave direction for staff to bring back a model that would allow the board to answer these questions reasonably. So those questions are, do the fees generated from contracted services generate incremental revenue that meaningfully offsets member city investment? Do we find that non-member cities are paying a premium for contracted services and those contracted services are defined to some restricted time frame? Do the contracted services and the model that we put forth encourage new member cities to join DCTA and expand the service area? And then do our contracted services position us as a regional leader in providing public transportation services for the region? Presumably, if these are the questions that are outlining the policy that you all are considering, then we would want to be able to answer, the board would want to be able to answer yes to all of those questions. The intent of this conversation is to show you a mathematical model that staff believes would allow you to answer yes. And if the board is agreeable to that approach, then we take this financial model and we bring it into the language of the policy. And then we start talking about what the policy, about the policy itself and how it actually reads. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay. So at your place, you have a printout that zooms into this table specifically so that you can more easily see the numbers. And I'm going to take a few minutes to walk you through this model. Really overall, what you're seeing here is a revenue and cost sort of model. What are the revenues that would be generated by the city of Frisco to pay for the service? And then what would the service actually cost? We're going to start the conversation around this model by looking at the assumptions that the model makes. And those assumptions are found at the top of the slide and also at the top of the handout that you have in front of you. First, we would assume, and a lot of these assumptions are informed by our long-range financial plan that our CFO briefed to you through our budget process, so that what we're assuming here is consistent with what we're assuming in our own financial plan. Where it's applicable, we've also referenced City of Frisco budgeting documents to make sure that we understand how they assume their long-range financial picture to be as well. So starting at the top, we're assuming member city sales tax growth grows at 2% a year. Same thing for the City of Frisco sales tax growth. We're presuming that the service cost growth is about 3.5% per year. That's what we assume in our long-range financial plan. The PTFA, recall, is the public transportation financing area. That's the device in our enabling legislation that kind of acts like an overlay district or a TERS or a TIF, where incremental revenue generated from sales tax and property tax could be dedicated as a funding source that goes beyond the 1 cent that the city has by state statute. Staff and resource cost growth is at 4% based on our long-range financial plan assumptions. We're assuming an indirect cost of service growth at 1%. And then the Frisco paratransit service that we'll talk about is, when at the time of the model, we didn't have the actual number, but the actual number now is in the same ballpark, $250,000. The administrative fee on that paratransit service is at 69%. And then we're assuming that the Frisco paratransit ridership is going to grow about 7% per year. Actually, it's been much more aggressive growth than that since it's been in practice, except for during the COVID pandemic, but 7% felt like a reasonable assumption. So with those assumptions, we'll start walking left to right across the model. What you see in these first 5 rows, or 5 columns rather, is the average of the Louisville and Denton city sales tax contribution to DCTA on an annual basis. You see in 2025, we're talking about $17.5 million per city. And then going down the column, it's simply factored for growth at 2% year over year. Next to that, we see, based on the best information that we can find, what is the Frisco 1 cent sales tax equivalent from the budgeting documents that we were able to put our hands on. And then the increment of that 1 cent from 1/4 cent to 3/16 of a cent to 1/8 of a cent. The reason we have to do that is because the board has said that we want to have the ability to bring new members in under contracted services that really tailors the revenue to fit the cost of the service that they're getting. That's the big differentiator between this model and the model that has existed at other agencies in the past, where it's a flat rate and all services are on the table. This is a model that is focused on GO zone in half of the city of Frisco for the right tax increment. So that's the revenue side. Any questions about that before I move on?
Questions from anyone?
Okay. So now the next 2 sets of columns will get into the cost side. And these are costs that are laid out according to what would be this new contracted service model. What you see starting up here at the 2.7 million, that's the cost of the contracted service from that previous slide for half of the city in the first year. And then that contracted service cost grows 3.5% per year based on the assumption as you go down the column.
Mhm.
The next column is referring to non-member costs for incremental staff and resources, because in the past, when we've done contracted services, they've been very small scale, and the administrative fee is intended to cover the cost of the existing DCTA resources that are used to provide those contracted services. When we talk about providing contracted services at the scale that we are here in Frisco, then we anticipate that we will need incremental resources in order to do that, be it systems, equipment, or personnel. We don't know what those things are yet, but we're making reasonable assumptions about what they might be. So that's where the $600,000 comes from. The non-member cost, indirect cost of service, is really a factored number that looks at what are the major budget line items required to deliver the service, and what is the share of ridership overall that's generated by the service. And then we factor that share of ridership versus those major budget items to assign the indirect cost. And I'll show you how that calculation works on the next slide. And then the next column is a non-member fee. The non-member fee is intended to be that premium for services that non-members pay when we're doing contracted services at scale. Now, if you're looking down the row of the non-member fee, what you see is that number grows very quickly over time. And that non-member fee is really the incentive, or provides the incentive for the contracted service city to say it would be more cost effective for me to become a member of DCTA than to continue in contracted services forever. While this board says we don't intend to do contracted services forever, but rather for a finite period of time. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Okay. On the next column, the next set of columns that you see is the existing paratransit service that we've been providing since 2015. In 2025, that service cost is about $250,000. The administrative fee is about 69%. And so when you sum across the right from here to here, what you see is the total cost of these services in the first year to the city of Frisco, both paratransit and the Go Zone service, would be $4.8 million. I think what's really important about this is we need to talk, if the board wants to go forward with this Go Zone opportunity, we need to put paratransit into that portfolio and not continue it on the same path that it has been forever as a contracted service since 2015. They're now getting a portfolio of services from DCTA, and we need to consider the portfolio holistically. So what happens over the course of this period from 2025 to 2030 is that all of these costs grow incrementally according to the assumptions that are made. But like I said, the real lever is that non-member fee that you see by the end of this period is at $5.7 million. And I'll have a graphic to show you next to show you what that looks like in a different way, and we'll talk further about that. So what the model is showing here, once we get to the end of the fifth year, and really what we're saying is, I'm not sure what time of this year, if this project goes forward, what time of 2025 this is going to go into effect. So it may be that year one of this service is actually 2026, but we have flexibility there to craft. But at the end of the fifth year, what you see is that the total cost of the service to the city of Frisco would be $11.1 million. And so assuming that the city would make a decision to then become a member of DCTA, we go now to the next set of columns over here. And if you compare 3.2 million to 6.6 million for the cost of service, that's basically a doubling of the cost of service. We would assume full city coverage on Go Zone by the end of the contracted service period when they would make the transition into membership. And then the cost of service over full city continues to grow through the rest of the model. And that the incremental staff and resource cost grows similarly. On the paratransit side, paratransit is already holistically citywide, so that number didn't grow as much. It just continues to grow by the increment that is in the assumption. And then the administrative fee that had been previously under the paratransit service goes into that incremental staff and resource cost. So at that point, the total cost of service is $8.4 million. So this is the jump from non-member to member, 11.1 down to 8.4, half city coverage to full city coverage. Make sense?
It does.
Okay. So now we have to look at where does the revenue come from to pay that cost. This is where we go back to the tax increments that we're putting together. You see how a quarter cent, 19 million, is way bigger than 8 million. So that doesn't work. 3/16 of a cent, 14.8, still way bigger. But at $9.8 million, you're at an 1/8 of a cent equivalent sales tax. So 9.8 versus the 8.4 million leaves you with about $1.5 million that is not covered by the service. And that is where we go into this idea of the Future Transit Investment Fund. This is additional revenue generated by the city of Frisco that begins to look to the future of what transit for that city might require, so that those dollars can be used at some future date. Then the last two columns that I'll show you is how does that revenue get generated? What you see there is a column that says public transportation financing revenue and general fund revenue. This would require the establishment of this public transportation financing area, the overlay district, around a fixed transit-based asset that says increment from property tax and sales tax goes towards funding that total cost of service, $8.4 million. The PTFA revenue at the outset could potentially be, and we would have to talk through this with the COG, but that could potentially be the UZA dollars that go into this area that the COG would be using on day one to fund this as a contracted service. The rest would come from general fund until such time as the PTFA revenue grows, for every dollar the PTFA revenue grows, the general fund revenue decreases, so that ultimately in the future, this is self-funded by the PTFA. But those UZA dollars stay in the mix as they come from the region to fund the entire piece of revenue. Does that make sense?
Let's run that by me again. I just want, I was thinking through so many things. So,
Sure.
so you're at 1/8 of a cent, and you were talking about that at this point, we would work with the region to have those UCA dollars that are for the Frisco, McKinney suburbanized area to be used within DCTA only.
Correct. Well, they would be put
DCTA
into,
and Frisco.
put into this service
Service.
to provide that seed money as the PTFA gets started. And that's really what's and these, again, this is a concept we have to refine to the precise dollars and cents, but that's what's happening today as the NCT cog has represented to the city of Frisco, that it's willing to put a significant amount of the money for the service on the table for it to get started. So then this is just demonstrating that money would persist through the life of the service.
So there's still going to be a little bit of the city of McKinney may have something to say about that.
That could happen.
Okay.
So one thing to note, and this is a place, so the board has flexibility in several different places that I'll point to as we refine this idea. But something interesting begins to happen in about year 2035, and that is the cost of the revenue generated by the 8th cent here at 10.7 million, and the cost of the service 9.7 million. They start to converge, and so the available for future transit investment goes below $1 million. Well, this board would have the ability to say, in the policy, either we're okay with that, or we'd like to set a minimum threshold for what that PTFA investment for future is. If you did set such a threshold, and that threshold was $1 million a year, then the model would have to go to the next available increment, which is really the 1/16 of a cent. So then the revenue trips to a 3/16 of a cent projection. Cost of service hasn't changed, but the money that goes into that future transit investment fund gets larger. I see this as a place where there's a lot of flexibility for conversation between this board and its policy, as well as with the city of Frisco as we work through this. But if by 2035, the city of Frisco has begun to say, hey, we think we need something additional, then that's where the revenue comes from to provide the additional transit service.
You're hoping that the hope is that the citizens of Frisco want to maintain this service and are more than willing to convince their council
To do something addition, to provide something in addition. But if they're not, then the increment could stay the same, and just recognize that the PTFA or the future transit investment contribution would get much smaller. And at some point you would end up where the 1/8 of a cent was no longer covering the cost of the service, and you would be forced to go to the 3/16 increment.
Yeah, I would think that's a policy decision that we would have to make. I would not want to. Again, we're just talking, so I would say, if it's just a me to vote, I would say we'd never want to ever to go to zero. We always want to make sure that the citizens in Frisco are paying their fair share for the service.
Right. So one way to look at this model, here's another way to look at the model, and this also is at your place. And this may look familiar to you, as we talked about it a couple of months ago. We also talked about it in the strategic workshop back in January. So under our typical contracted services approach, if we were to do this Frisco Go Zone opportunity under our typical contracted services approach, we would have the $250,000 for paratransit, the 2.7 million for Go Zone, and then we would have the administrative fee for paratransit and the administrative fee for Go Zone. And the total of that would be about $4.8 million. And those administrative fees, again, are intended to cover to offset the cost of the administrative and other support required to deliver the service. But since this is at scale and we anticipate other things will be required, we want to look at it under the second bar, which is how do those dollars and cents get established or get parsed under a contracted service model that's got an eye towards membership at the end of a defined period. So same cost of service for GO Zone, same cost of service for paratransit, but we parse out the dollars for incremental staff and resources. We parse out the dollars for the indirect cost of service. That indirect cost of service calculation is there over on the right. That is, we anticipate 183,000 rides a year. That's about 6% of all of our rides at DCTA. Then there's following that is the budget line items that are delivering that capability. And we just simply factor that to get to that indirect cost of service share. So that's where that orange number comes from. And then the next item is the administrative fee we're getting under the paratransit service, because we're not going to change that over the course of this next 5 years. And the difference between what used to be the line for contracted services with an admin fee and the sum of all these other numbers is what our new member fee turns out to be for the first year. But then if you go back to the other page, and you remember how that new member fee grows significantly year over year, by the end of the 5th year of the approach, the new member fee is significant. That is intended to be incremental revenue, premium for the contracted service, and encouraging new members to join DCTA. Because when you get to this point, and the 1/8 of a cent is only $9.9 million, you're saying, I could get double the service. I get service over the entirety of the city of Frisco, and I get to save $2 million a year. That presumably provides an incentive to recognize over the course of this period, the city has realized the value of public transportation and the value that DCTA brings, and is encouraged and incentivized to join because their total out-of-pocket cost is less for more service. More service that originated from exactly the service that was requested with exactly the increment that's required to deliver the service. So if we think about where we are as a region, we have models that say, if you pay 1 penny, you get all services. With Trinity Metro, you have a model that says we can do a contracted service over a long period for a dedicated funding source that's tied in to what is the cost of that service. And then that is what we have here as well. The ability to put the service on the road for the revenue that covers the cost of that service. And if at the end of that period, it doesn't work for DCTA or it doesn't work for the city, then either party can say, thank you, and we'll move on to other things. So back to these questions. Do fees generate incremental revenue? Did we pay a premium? You all get to decide if the answer to that question is yes or no. Does it encourage new members to join DCTA? We've tailored the scope to the city's request. We have a cost plus a fee as a contracted service. We have a dedicated funding structure tailored in 16th cent increments. And there's flexibility on how that future transit investment fund works. And then does it put us in a position as a regional leader in providing public transportation? I think the answer to that is yes. This allows us to take this conversation about how do new member cities join transit agencies. We take that from where it is today to a very precise business case that we can get to the opportunity to engage on.
Where's Frisco on those conversations?
I think that fair question. I think they're interested to understand what our intent is, and they're interested to understand what the region is willing to put forward in order to pay for it. We've had great engagement with their staff at all levels. We've had great engagement with the business community. And so it's been really good dialogue, and this conversation we're having here today allows us to take that dialogue to the next level.
So I guess the question for the board is, if we accept this, this is what you're gonna take to the Frisco manager and the council for them to, you're gonna basically give them this information and they have to process it internally.
Well, the first thing would be take this model and attempt to put language around it that reflects in the policy. And that's probably happening simultaneously while this conversation is happening with the city, because I think they're on parallel paths at the moment.
Okay. Any other questions?
Are we looking for direction on any particulars, especially about like the future transit investment fund?
It is a discussion item, but yeah, I think he's looking for something is he going the right direction?
Yeah.
Or is there some fatal flaw or something that we want to put the brakes on?
That's exactly right. I think, is this the direction? Does the board feel like, we've said, we've heard you say, these are the questions that we need to answer. Do we feel like this model adequately answers those questions? And I'm also interested in where you think there's flexibility for the board to work that could also be written into the policy. For example, what is the threshold of that future transit investment fund before it trips to the next increment, I think is one of those places. So that's the direction that we're looking for today.
Yeah, I think that the general direction of this is great. I think the work that staff has done on this is great. As far as the future transit investment fund, I agree that we shouldn't let it get down all to zero. But I think I would need more information about how we set that threshold. I mean, $1 million sounds good, but it also feels a little bit arbitrary from where I'm sitting. So I'd love to have a conversation around that. But I also, I want to give staff some flexibility, and I also want to just give staff some encouragement around this. I know that this has been a lot of work. I know that there are a lot of moving parts that are beyond our control here. And I think that regardless of what happens, this has been a really great exercise in setting our priorities and setting our goals as a regional leader in transit. And I think that this methodology is one that we can for sure continue to use. So thank y'all for that.
I was just gonna say, I agree that the approach that we're taking with the different fee structures, and we are giving an incentive to look at this as a path to membership, and not necessarily just we want to do this for a couple of years and then we're done. I am a little worried about the city's appetite to want to do that. But I have a question about how we have a model where we're showing that there's, at least for this particular case, there's a certain increment that works for a period of time, and then another increment we need another increment to keep it moving forward from there. And as far as that increment goes, how do we?
The election.
Yeah, they would have to have an election to approve it initially, and then they'd have to have an election to approve a bigger one, right? So there's what happens if we get to a place where they agree to the 1/8, but then by the time we get to a point where it's not covering the cost anymore and we need to increase it, they say no.
I had the same question, since we're just discussing, because I wrote it down here, is that, do they have to sign some type of interlocal agreement that says if your revenue never covers your cost, you must go up? Something actually. Yeah,
But isn't that obligating future councils to a certain?
So
Yeah, you can't raise taxes by an interlocal agreement, can we?
Right, so we have to, this is where we're working under the assumption of the public transportation financing area. Not actually the sales tax itself. This revenue is coming from the taxes that are generated out of the PTFA, the increment generated out of the PTFA. not the sales tax itself. And
Okay.
so,
Even going forward with membership.
Part of the general fund revenue that's factored in here.
right, the general fund revenue, if that's what we're talking about, then, yeah, that is something that would have to be considered.
Okay.
But
That's very helpful. Yeah, that clarifies things for me a lot. Sorry.
Um,
Sorry to hijack your
But
question.
I would say,
I'm glad that I was not the only one who had that
Yeah.
question. My final, thought is, you know, I think we've done a lot to address number 3. Number 4, I think we're going that direction by saying we want, by implementing a new policy that encourages people to join DCTA versus contracted services is making us more of a regional player. However, I don't want Frisco over on the side that's not connected to anything else in the county. I would like to see, how do we connect, since there is no rail currently going that direction, how do we connect that with the rest of the network? Because I think that's equally important in us being a regional player. And I realize there's cities in between here and there, but how do we connect it so that it's a connected network, not just for their citizens, but for all of the member cities' citizens as well?
great question. And the technical approach would involve looking at the model that presented at the beginning of this to say, not just what does it take to cover service in the city of Frisco, but what does it take to cover what we'd anticipate demand to be moving between Frisco and Louisville and Highland Village and Denton. And so that would cause, almost certainly, the cost of the service to increase. And so then the conversation goes to, well, what is the cost share between other member cities and the city of Frisco in order to allow that for that interconnectivity? That's the next level of complexity after what we have in front of us, for sure. And I would say, you know, when it comes to the idea of how do we identify this general fund revenue, or how do we rely on the general fund revenue into the future? That question exists also if we were to say this is a minimum of a 3-year, if both sides say yes to this deal, then we would not want to stand up a GO Zone service for 1 year. It's a significant effort to stand it up. So we would want to say this is a 3-year minimum, maybe up to 5 years at the outset, which would require the NCT COG to come to the table with a commitment to fund that far in advance, as well as the city of Frisco to fund that far in advance. And we could certainly engage with our legal counsel on how those sorts of things are structured for cities and agencies like ours.
Yeah, back to the regional things. In Collin County, you know, we have new demographics now in places like Princeton, Allen, McKinney itself, that are, is there some add to scale, if you will? Is there cost benefits on scaling up what you've got here, just out of Frisco, but by scaling up and bringing other people into the fold?
I think good question. I think it's a pretty broad one. I mean,
Yeah.
certainly there's capacity. When you add capacity to the agency to deliver service, there is some means of you can get a lot more done when you add incremental resources into the agency itself. But the microtransit service on its own, there really doesn't scale. You're paying a service cost per service hour per vehicle, and those vehicles turn a finite number of trips
Right.
in a given time.
Okay.
Question for you real quick. So if we're looking under the non-member fees and specifically bullet point 3 related to encouraging new members, we are lost on the fact of what formula or metrics did you go from 232,000 a non-member fee, and then within 5 years you got to 5.7 to really kind of show an $11 million versus $8 million difference to be a member or non-member. So what if I was a city looking at this, I would want to know, how did you get to that number from 200,000 to 5.7 million in 5 years?
by looking at a number of different factors of what that number would have to change by. Well,
No, that's another, that's a
it's,
whole
no, it's
other one
beyond,
for that.
it goes beyond the administrative fee. It's looking at what is the factor on the number? And what is the sales tax increment that at the end of the 5 years generates enough of a delta between the non-member structure and the member structure to say there's a step downward to be taken. So what you're pointing to is this is, and what will be a good opportunity for us to do as we put this into language is to figure out how do you write it in such a way that acknowledges this would be tailored to every case would be tailored somewhat differently, because as we think about the same policy for the city of Corinth, that's going to look completely different. If we think about this policy with regard to other cities in Denton County that may want these services in the future, it's going to look different. But the point is that by the end of that 5-year period, we know what the tax increment is that's needed to get started. And at the end of the 5-year period, we're looking for enough of a premium that would encourage someone to make a city to make the investment in long term, because they appreciate the service, they see the value as, they see a high value out of the service, and they want to continue it, recognizing they're getting a better deal than they were at the outset.
And that's exactly kind of why I asked the question is you're at the same time, it may look different, but you're also setting a standard for other municipalities in joining the membership, in my opinion.
Yes, sir.
Any other questions? Comments?
No, go ahead.
Just one, and this is a comment. I think we've had discussions about this before. I think first, credit to staff for trying to work something out to make something like this happen, to bring in new members. I think we still, as we go through these things, we will have a little bit of difficulty convincing the original members with the fairness and equity of a Frisco or somebody else coming in after we've already invested our sales tax dollars over all these years. Suddenly they're going to pop in, they're going to get a à la carte menu to choose from. But that's just the way it is. But I think we do need to be mindful of that to make sure that that can be explained well, because I think some people have always felt like if a new city comes in, they've got to buy into the system. They've got to pay for the rail that's been built and everything else. So we need to make sure that we can cover those things and then really make sure people do look at this in a holistic approach. Because to grow the system that way, we know you can't do that. You can't make somebody buy the rail, particularly Frisco. To your point, they're not even connected here. So I think that's going to be one of the more artful things, even getting through Frisco to them with the member cities, to make sure that our residents are comfortable with that as well.
Yes, sir.
It's a good comment. I think that's something we could also use as we explain what the non-member fee is. And there's something tied to the fact that the other 3 cities have been paying and building the backbone of this system for, what's it, 20 something years now? Forgive me, I forget the exact time frame, but that helps explain that. And there's some, we can never go back. I think that approach was tried by DART and it doesn't work. You cannot go back to the beginning of DART and say, Alan, if you want to come into DART, you gotta pony up. That doesn't work. So we can't use that. This sort of kind of does something in the middle that recognizes some of the member cities' contributions. I like the way you tie it to that, so that it does go to help incentivize them to someday come to us, or after a period of time, 3 or 5 years, whatever we determine the minimum is, they don't feel they're getting service, well, then we can part ways and no hard feelings.
If I may, I think that a key component of kind of our conversations with the folks that we're representing here is that adding new member cities is an important aspect of our strategy for maintaining the long-term financial health of the agency. I think that's a really important piece for us to communicate to anybody who might be concerned about fairness, that with or without concerns about fairness, we need to be concerned about our long-term financial plan and new sources of revenue.
So I guess at this point, is there you're not truly asking for an action, but you are asking for some direction. Do we feel that he is moving in the right direction with the policy? Oh,
Yeah, so
here we go.
if the board is comfortable with generally, it's recognizing all the comments and things that we need to tighten down around on this. If the board is comfortable with this in concept, then we're gonna modify the draft of that new member city admission and contracted services policy we presented a few months ago to include language that reflects the structure. We'll also consider how this financial model adapts to other contracted services arrangements like the city of Corinth. We'll strive to bring this back as a red line policy draft for the December 12th board meeting. And then we are having concurrent conversations with the city of Frisco and NCT-COG on this item. And so we will keep you apprised of that dialogue as well. If you all are comfortable with this, then we could proceed in this direction.
Comfortable comments, anything? Anybody want to add that?
With this on, we're looking for correct. The same exercise.
So it's very, very easy for us to put the work that we've already done with Corinth into this structure. The city of Corinth conversation is awaiting the finalizing of, or the better cost estimating around the cost of the station and the cost of the track appurtenances that would go along with standing that up, which is going to be task one as we award our program management and consulting services contract.
Okay.
Yeah, Paul, I mean, great presentation and really phenomenal work. What's the timeline to get this in place? Was there a fixed timeline? Is there a deadline, or is it just preparatory conversation? So when everyone's ready, we're ready.
I think that is the latter is the right answer. Certainly the NCT-COG and the city of Frisco are interested in where DCTA stands on this opportunity, and they know that this policy is in development. So want to get this back to them. And then once we do that, then would allow the conversation to kind of ensue between the COG and the city of Frisco while we turn our attention to the business at hand for DCTA.
Any other questions? Staff? Seeing none? Proceed forward. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
I guess now we turn over to the 2 and 3 were covered simultaneously.
Yes, sir.
And now we'll move on to regular item 4, update on the transportation reinvestment program policy. Will be also Stina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to invite Karina Maldonado, our planning manager, up to the podium as well, because we are going to run through an update on our TRIP program. Karina will talk you through the current state of the dollars that have been awarded and what those projects look like. And then I'm going to come back up to the front and talk about policy items that can be utilized to amend the policy if the board chooses to go that direction. So Karina, it's all yours.
All right, good morning, Karina Maldonado, Planning Manager and Trip Program Manager. So as Paul mentioned, we'll be going through the kind of the status of where everything is. And then we'll get to this later, which is essentially, we have the TRIP program now. The policy was adopted in November of 2020 as a 5-year program. So what that means for us today is that we're approaching the end of the policy. As it's written, it states that the policy automatically expires after the 5 years if no board action is taken. So the discussion today surrounds what do we do with the TRIP policy once we hit that point in the next year.
So we've laid out three potential options for this program. First being that the board approves the extension of the trip policy as written, meaning no changes, and it would just be extended for a period of time that the board chooses. Option two being that the board approves an updated trip policy, and we'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation as to what that would focus around. And option three would be that the board takes no action and allows the trip policy to expire after the next upcoming call for projects, which is that fiscal year 25 call. So now I'll get into the numbers of the program. Just as more like a status report of where we are after the 4 years. But I do want to take a step back and just define some of the terms on this slide. So first you'll see total annual authorizations. You also see reference to total obligated, total executed and spent, as well as unobligated. So what those mean, and I'll sort of go from left to right. Total annual authorizations is something that you might recognize every January when staff brings the amounts for every fiscal year call to the board for approval. So you can think of it as the total program cost for every year. When we look at it combined, we see that over the life of the program thus far, we've had $39.1 million available for projects to be submitted through this call for projects. As we move forward to what that total obligated is, again, going back to that trip policy process, this is what you see every summer when the cities submit their projects. They have a specific project scope, budget, and a project that is transit supportive that they're requesting that funding for. Once the board approves those projects, they become obligated into a reimbursement agreement. So we can see that over the 4 years of this program, we've had $32.1 million programmed or obligated into reimbursement agreements. This does include the approvals from last month, which was that fiscal year 25 pre-award amount. So that is the total thus far. Now we get to the last little bubble here where it talks about total executed and spent. This relates to actual reimbursement. So this is a reimbursement program, which means that all of those obligated projects, when they're implemented, those member cities are responsible for incurring the cost, being responsible for the cost related to it. And then once it's paid, they seek reimbursement from DCTA. And so the number reflected here is as of today. So of the life of the program, only 3.2 million has been requested for reimbursement. So when we look at that broken down by member city, we see, and I'll go left to right, total authorized of the 39 million. City of Denton has had 17.9 million available through the life of the program. 1.8 has been available for Highland Village, and then 19.2 million available for City of Louisville. Now, as we move left into the table, we see that City of Denton has really utilized the program into projects. So we see that they've obligated roughly 17.1 million. And we'll look at those projects in the next couple slides. That's about 23 projects that they've had obligated. Highland Village had one project, and that is the 379,000 that you see. And City of Louisville has obligated 14.6. So when we look at percent wise, we see that 5% has remained unobligated for the City of Denton, 80%, 24% respectively for Highland Village and Louisville. But when we look at the overall program, that means that 18% has remained unobligated from the 39.1 million. And please feel free to stop me for questions if I'm saying too many numbers.
So to take it up one more level, so we authorized almost 39.1 million. And we only spend the money when the city does a project and requests reimbursement. So,
Yes,
okay. So that means that we have 35.9 million sitting in our coffers, so to speak, that is earmarked for the cities, but just sitting there right now.
Yes, that's correct. And I'll go through each project to show the status of those projects. So just I want to kind of preface this with, this is amount that has not been reimbursed, like you mentioned, but that does not necessarily mean that the projects aren't moving forward. It just means the
Understand.
rate of
Yeah.
expenditure where we're at today, we're seeing that 10% has only been reimbursed over the life of the program. Right. So these are the projects I've mentioned, including up to the fiscal year 25 pre-award last month. A total of 31 projects have been awarded through this program. Like I mentioned, I had to split it into two sides, but City of Denton has 23 projects that they're implementing. Highland Village has one, and that project is completed. And City of Louisville now has up to 7 projects that they will be implementing. I think one note to make on this slide is the type of projects that have been submitted thus far. So in terms of project activities, we've seen the majority of projects have been geared towards design and construction, with a few coming in through the last few months that included a planning element to them. So that's something to keep in mind as we continue this discussion is what we want to see here in types of eligible projects. The other thing I'll note is the actual type of project itself. So we've seen a lot of sidewalk and trail connectivity to help get folks to our transit system. We've seen complete street options through the City of Louisville. We've also seen quiet zone crossings, so safety improvements related to the A train. Those are also the type of projects that we've seen.
Quick question.
Yes.
So talking about Highland Village, just so I want to make sure I understand all the math, right? There's an authorized 1.86 million. There's an obligated 379,000. So what we're saying is that Highland Village potentially has 1.4 million still that they could use for projects. The 379 that has been obligated, 100% of that is executed. So Highland Village has already submitted 100% of the reimbursement for that, correct?
That is correct.
Okay,
Yes.
perfect.
All right, so I'll break this down a little bit further, more focus on the project status. So going back to that reimbursement, where are these projects actually in the lifespan of their implementation? So starting with the City of Denton, just because they have the majority of the projects, we can see that for fiscal year 21, almost half, more than half are complete. So that was over the last few months. The City of Denton has requested reimbursement for those. So those projects have not only been completed and implemented, they've sought the reimbursement for those projects. The remaining that you see do have design completion, and they will be grouped together for bid at the start of the next year. So those will begin the actual construction phase in the next few months. Going down to fiscal year 22, we do have a couple of completed projects just pending the actual reimbursement. Those are actually at my direction to start at the fiscal year, just so we didn't have any, we didn't mess up any year-end stuff, but they are moving, they are complete. They just need that final reimbursement request. I'll note one project has not yet started. The justification we've seen for this one is that this project has stayed in the planning stage due to some neighborhood engagement, wanting to make sure that they have the right solution for that neighborhood, which is a historically disadvantaged area. So they want to be conscious of citizens' requests in that area. Finally, fiscal year, or for this slide, fiscal year 23, again, everything moving to final design and moving towards construction. I do want to note D18, this often comes up, is that we have a distinction between the TRIP project status and the overall project status. So you can see overall projects are moving forward, but since the majority of requests are for sidewalks, those are typically an installation at the end of a project. So we see that it's sort of delayed, but really the project is progressing. And of course, fiscal year 24 for Denton and Louisville, those are pending the execution of reimbursement agreements. So that's with us right now. As we move into Highland Village, as was mentioned earlier, that project is complete. They have requested reimbursement. And so that is done. Going on to the City of Louisville, I did make some last minute changes on here about the percent design for L2 and L5. Those are actually grouped together. So I guess I'll take a step back and make a point that what we do see with some of these project submittals is that we're almost seeing phases requested. So there may be one segment of a corridor that is requesting a project, and then the next year, another phase is requested. So the project itself is moving with different agreements tied to them. So when we see here, we do have one complete, two that are, or one at 100% design, two at 95% design, and then one that is expected to start, I can't read my notes. They'll start expecting reimbursement soon, since that is a design only project. They're near the end. And so now I'll kick it back to Paul to go through the remaining slides. I guess while he's coming up here, is there any additional questions related to the status of the program?
Question. So with it, how does the reimbursement work? So does because it looks like there's a lot of projects that are in process, but the amount of money that's been invoiced is zero. So do they have to be all the way through with the whole thing before they send an invoice for reimbursement? How does that work?
That's a great question. When I came in, there was a lot of ensuring that we're kind of reaching a quarterly status so that we ensure that projects are incurring costs and then quarterly requesting reimbursements. I believe the way it was set up at the start is that there was an agreement that we would either do it annually, quarterly, or as determined between the member city and the agency. I can't speak to how it was done in the past specifically, but my understanding is that they could request reimbursement at any time. So if the cost was incurred monthly and they wanted to submit monthly invoices, that was an option. So long as the reimbursement agreement is executed, you're able to sort of request that as needed.
Okay. I guess my takeaway there is just that when you look at the numbers that say we have this much that has not been executed, it's been obligated but not executed. That's really only an accounting transaction between the city and DCTA because it has been executed on the city side and they're paying for it. They just haven't requested reimbursement.
That's correct.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement, and I think what we have now, thanks to these views that Karina's begun putting together, is better clarity about how these projects are moving through their own pipeline. And so on our end, we do see, did we give them money for the project or not? But now we've got better clarity about where they are in the process, so we can come to understand reasonably what to expect. We haven't not gotten to the point yet where we are saying, well, we forecast this money to be obligated by this or executed by this certain amount of time. But I think as we evolve and as the dialogue and the relationship between the city and the agency progress, we'll get even more clarity in that regard. So with that as the backdrop, and thank you, Karina, for your work there. We want to talk about what does the trip policy say today and what might it say in the future? And really, this is going back to the very beginning. You do have three options. You could extend the policy as written, you could approve an updated policy, or you could take no action and the trip policy goes away. And so I guess we would look for board direction on what you would like to do moving forward, but we've structured this presentation under the assumption that the board would likely want to extend the policy in some form or fashion. So with that, these excerpts are language from the current policy, and then how that language could be potentially modified. The idea is not to give you a red line of the entire document today, but rather get these major policy points and understanding about where the board is today, and then bring back a red line in the future so that this policy can be amended and updated and adopted quickly. So let's start that conversation. First, Right now, it's a 5-year policy. This could become an evergreen policy. One comment that the board has made in the past is we like the idea of TRIP, but we want to maintain flexibility year over year. We'll talk about what that flexibility could look like, but there could be an opportunity to say we want to make this evergreen, or we just want to do it for another 5-year period and then revisit. Right now, the policy doesn't have really any defined terms in it, but we think the defined terms are important because, especially as we talk about how the money flows through the process, we want to talk about authorized funds, obligated funds, and executed funds. This has been a topic of conversation with the board in the past. What happens to unobligated funds? Well, the way the policy is written today is that if there are unobligated funds in the program by the end of the 5th year, that those funds would return to DCTA after fiscal year 2025. My assumption and understanding is that the board would not like to see that happen. So the policy could be modified to say unobligated funds from fiscal 21 to 25 do not expire at the end of 2025. But the board may consider that we do want to put some sort of time frame around the obligation and the execution of those funds. Given the conversation about what does it mean to be executed versus obligated, maybe you want to set a timeline that says you get 3 years to obligate funds and then you get 2 years to expend funds. Maybe you want to make those timelines broader, or maybe you don't want to have any timelines at all. If we did that, then we would also want to say that we're always assuming that we're expending the oldest funds first. So that if there's money that's unauthorized or unobligated from fiscal year 2025 and we're in fiscal year 2028 and the city brings in a request for a project, that would be those 2025 funds that get applied first so that they don't expire. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay. And I'll go through all of these and then we can take the conversation wherever you'd like. Current language says the annual budget for TRIP is 15% of the net available fund balance from the previous fiscal year. Potentially, the board could modify in light of this idea about having flexibility in the program, that you have the ability to provide an annual amount less than 15%. Or the annual TRIP program is maximum of 10% of the net available fund balance, and the board still has an ability to provide an amount less than that. Or that the board has the ability to designate an annual TRIP authorization to a project of common benefit that would be defined by the board, but the A-Train enhancement program comes to mind. And then again, from a 5-year policy to an evergreen policy, and it seems like modification of these 2 provisions while preserving unauthorized funds from 21 to 25 meets the expectations of the DCTA board and the member cities as the policy was originally written, and then gives the board ultimate flexibility moving forward on how the program is administered. The program or the policy talks about eligible projects, and it lists a whole bunch of eligible projects. I think we've seen a lot of that over the course of the last 4 years. But the board, based on conversation, we may want to say in the policy amendment, it can only be utilized for final design and construction. That would exclude the use of TRIP money for feasibility studies and planning documents. And this other item is, I think, an interesting one, that the eligible project types would remain, but the board would say that the project to be done exists both in the requesting city's master plan, some planning document that exists at that member city, also within the DCTA long-range service plan. If the project is in the DCTA long-range service plan and in the member cities plan, then that is the means by which both the board and the city have come to an agreement that this is a transit supportive project, and allows the board some sense of comfort that the project has been vetted through all of those channels with an eye towards the long term. And then lastly, right now, the policy does not say anything about use of funds for land acquisition or project management. The policy could exclude the use of funds for land acquisition and project management so that it's focused on, we say TRIP money went to this infrastructure that is now in the ground. And then lastly, projects, when it comes to disbursement and reporting, right now, the policy talks about 2 different annual reports that talk about expenses incurred, billed, percent complete, and how the project is proceeding. I think we'd modify it to say, let's just do two reports a year, every 6 months, covering all of those topics. One of those reports comes to this board in March of every year, which is right before the budget cycle starts, so that you all can have that in mind as you're thinking about what to authorize for the TRIP program for the following year. So again, those are intended as the highlights of the main portions of the policy that might want to be considered by the board. I'm happy to open it up for comments and questions and the direction.
Let's start by talking a little bit about the history, because I was there when the first one came about. Few of us were, not all of us. So at that time, my recollection was the board was at a very different place. We wanted to create a policy to give something back to our member cities. And we modeled it similar to what DART had done in the past. And it was at that time intended to be a 5-year policy because the long range projections would show that after a period of time, we cannot sustain that. If I fast forward to today, next year, our obligation amount that we set in our budget that we approved is a little over $10 million. So that will bring the total TRIP commitment to the 3 member cities at just under $50 million. That's
Actually, Mr. Chairman, if I could, I think the number in the budget is 5.9.
Is it 5.9?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Or I don't know where I got 10.
So
okay.
you'd be about 45. This past year, it was 10 million.
It was, okay. Okay. So anyway, so that's still almost $45 million to all 3 member cities. And then at that time, we did not have in our budget long range elements for rail maintenance or bus maintenance. We didn't have a long range plan for the expansion of the A train. So anyway, I just want to point that out to you so as we consider all these things. And again, I'll point out that that's, 39 million has been obligated. Only 3.2 has been spent. Probably the city has done more than 3.2, I imagine, but I don't think they've done 39 or even the 35 that they obligated. It's probably something less. They're still spending it down. I know these projects takes a long time from the time you design it to the time you build it. It takes years. So another $5.5 million, it's going to take a little bit more time for the cities to spend through that. So anyway, I want to just kind of put that out there, set this table on that a little bit. So Allison.
Yeah. So thank you so much for that. Oh, yeah. Yeah, thank you for that context. I think that obviously we are in a very different position than we were when the TRIP policy was initially.
Were you here?
I was not.
Just came right
Yeah,
after.
no, I was, this was at least 2 or 3 years, I think, before I came around. So I think that obviously we have very different plans now. But the nature of our funding model, in my opinion, requires that we have something like the TRIP policy, even if in out years we don't plan on having a lot of unallocated funds. We have no idea what might happen, right? Our long-range financial projections are just projections. We've had years in recent memory where our sales tax revenues were unexpectedly high, and where it would not have been fiscally responsible of us to do anything other than implement it, the TRIP program and give it back to member cities through the TRIP program. So even though, even with our projections the way that they are, I feel like we still need a TRIP program. Now, I do agree that there are some tweaks that need to be made going forward. I love the suggestions that staff has made about structuring, authorized, obligated and executed funds, and kind of, giving a grace period or a little bit of grandfathering with unauthorized funds from prior years, while having a forward-looking plan that really encourages member cities to get those funds spent. I don't know if I would support, the board having authority to reduce the amount of trip. I think that the lever that we have to control how much is in the trip account or how much is getting dispersed through trip is how much we allocate to transit spending, I think. And I don't know that we need another lever. Can staff explain to me what the purpose of that suggestion is, I guess?
Which piece was
So section 3 funding, the potential modification is board has the authority to provide an annual amount less than 15%.
Well, I think to the point that was made previously, we now are building a long-range financial plan that identifies expenditures that are going to be required for capital replacement, capital maintenance in the out years. But there are some things like the A-Train enhancement program that we all know are there, the TOD project at Old Town Louisville that we know are there, but don't show up in great detail in our long-range financial plan. Giving the board this flexibility allows them to make decisions based on the totality of what they understand about where the agency is. If we didn't have that, then we would be, not we, but it could be possible that the long-range financial plan then gets inflated in order to reflect a number that isn't based in reality, and we don't want that either. So giving you all the opportunity to have that flexibility with all the things you understand today and into the future is really what the intent is.
And
Sherelle?
yeah, I just wanted to jump in and add just one component to that is to the extent, so I hear you asking the question about the 15%. Essentially what we do in making that calculation, because by policy right now it says 15%. We also had some conversations about bringing this back before the board prior to the actual budget coming forward to kind of inform this number. And what this potential modification is talking about is some flexibility for that number once we come up with the available balance, for that number to be calculated using something 15% or less, and having the board to have some flexibility to say, this year in particular, in 2026 or 2027, looking at the totality of things, we prefer to use a 5% or a 10% reserving policy for this particular year in order to allocate funds. And maybe in subsequent years, you have the ability to adjust that percentage is what this is suggesting.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I have another question, I guess the same question about another potential modification. Excluding the use of trip funds for land acquisition and project management costs. So obviously sometimes sidewalk construction requires right-of-way acquisition. Can you explain to me the reasoning behind wanting to disallow that? This is on section 4 eligible projects.
Right here.
Yeah, it's way at the bottom there. Excludes use of trip.
Can I just jump in real quick too, because I had the same question, because sometimes a land acquisition can be associated with something that is important as far as, let's say, the DCTA Old Town Station. There's a lot of land around that could be used to enhance and better that overall development. So I feel like there's probably a legitimate way to use that. And as long as the land acquisition and the project management costs are associated with things that we feel as an organization and from the city and DCTA support our goals, I don't see why we would exclude those costs.
And Well, and I'll go first. I think.
all want to talk or they all
If the intent of the trip program is to have things that are above the ground that people can say that was a DCTA, DCA is assisted with that project as a trip funded project, then you would want to have dollars going to hard costs that are visible as people are moving about. Sometimes in land acquisition, the property gets purchased, but it takes many years in order for the project to get realized. But again, this is your policy. That was the thinking.
I agree that that should be in the policy. That it's money, the trip money should not go to land acquisition and project management costs. I agree with what you're saying, that it should be actual construction costs.
So right now, the policy is silent. So it means it's almost on a case by case basis.
Right.
So as a board, we could either decide to exclude it, and by writing it in there, we can leave it silent, which means we deal with it on a case by case basis, or we allow it. There's basically three options, right?
Was there anything?
I think sometimes it can be a legitimate and almost there may be some cases where that's really, something comes up last minute and the city is like, we want to purchase this so we can make sure it doesn't turn into something that is not conducive or doesn't support the transit-oriented development that we're trying to establish in this area. So I mean, from that case, I would like to, I don't want it to be excluded. I would prefer to see it be something that, if, you know, at a minimum that the board would consider on a case by case basis.
I'll give you a real life example that when I was with the city of Carrollton, about 20-something years ago, 25 years ago, the Home Depot relocated from Green Mill Center to near City Hall off of Josie and Jackson. And we discussed with their real estate person, they were willing to sell to us. And we went to the dartboard and said, can we use, at that time, our lap funds? And it was allowed. And we used something like $3 million of lap funds to acquire that. And that now became a transit-oriented development site. It was a very specific, we had already identified that as that's going to be a future station. And so it would be something where it's tied to transit. I would support that case like that. So, you know, if it's something where it's that it's tied to a transit type development, I think I would support it. I would support something that, as long as it has something tied to that.
That, and I think that, oh, I'm sorry. I think that the item above it supports that, the idea of aligning our plan with city plans, gives us that opportunity.
I would say when I worked at Addison 25 years ago, the town went in and bought all this property. So we have a future train station there, which is there now, and gave everybody life estates and bought them out and used money to go ahead and create that. So I mean, I support land acquisition for that. How are y'all defining project management costs? What does that mean?
I think I would define it as specific to program management fees associated with some large development. Obviously, if there's a construction contract and there's a construction administration task or something like that, those could be considered project management fees, not addressed by this. But if it was a project that says we need program management services for this other thing that we're doing, that those dollars are going to a contract that is not actually turning dirt, but supporting a project that is turning dirt. That's what
I would not be as in favor of that. I think it needs to be more bricks and mortar. I don't want cities then wanting reimbursement because we've been I want you to pay for our public works department to do plan review. These cities pull that all the time with the county, us to pay them when we're giving them money to build a red light or something. So it's just me personally. I think it ought to stick more brick and mortar, land acquisition, going vertical on projects that are visible instead of.
ask a
Management
question
costs.
just for clarity? Ask a question for clarity on the land acquisition. So in that scenario that we talked about where the city of Carrollton worked with DART for the $3.2 million worth of acquisition. I don't have an idea of scope of how much the total land purchase was in relation to the 3.2 million, but let's just say that the whole piece of land cost 3 million. Okay. In that instance, the reason that we're having this conversation about land acquisition, who owns that land? If DART in that instance were reimbursing for the full purchase price of that land under the premise that it was being converted into a TOD, is there an agreement that is signed that solidifies that use of that land? Who owns that land if the transit authority is paying for all or nearly all of the purchase of that land? You see, it gets muddy.
Yeah,
But it's
and
one-
on top of that, but on top of that,
No.
you also have a situation where that was a piece of land in Carrollton that benefited the people of Carrollton. You know, say you do that in Louisville, for example, benefits the people of Louisville. How does that benefit the people of Highland Village that have contributed tax dollars to the trip fund? If it
So-
doesn't, then why are we doing it? It needs to be a benefit to all, right?
No.
I don't think that's the intent.
I think that's the reason why the trip funds are allocated based on the amount and the.
But when you talk about
and the-
land acquisition, it's a different.
Maybe,
Expenditure.
maybe. But I just wanted to bring that into play as we're considering these types of things on a case-by-case basis, because depending on a sidewalk is fairly innocuous in that example. But depending on how much of a land purchase we're talking about, it can be very, things that we have to walk through as a.
And when you get into eminent domain as well, that can complicate things too. If you're looking at a piece of land that you're trying to justify the use of eminent domain.
Right.
And do we want to get into that fight with the city?
So just wanted to help with that.
So I'll just give you history. The city owned that land. Similar, it's the concept, the lab program is similar to this in that every city was allocated a portion of funds. As long as you met the requirements in the policy, which is what we're talking about, what are eligible projects. The board allowed that to happen. And once that happened, that money is allocated to that project. And it becomes the city's at the end, so the city owned the land. Just like a city would own the street or the sidewalk or. et
And
cetera.
one thing that could help this is if the policy was written to say projects that are submitted for trip funding should exist in the master plan for the city and the agency's long-range
Yeah.
service plan, then that's a way that could be vetted to say, yeah, we agree that this is a good usage. So
So, I mean, I'm generally in favor of that, but if the majority of the board doesn't want it, or if you guys want to keep it silent, we can just deal with it on a case by case. Or we can put it in there, land acquisition to be, addressed on a case by case basis, if that's what the board wants, and we can simply, when one comes up, we can simply talk about it.
I think just by listening to everybody, I think I'm the only person that has said, I don't want trip funds to be used for land acquisition and project management costs. I think everybody else is open to something a little more liberal. And so given that, I would support it being on a case by case basis.
Sure.
I feel like I didn't get very clear direction. So I think now that I understand what we're talking about a little bit better, I don't think there's any need to explicitly exclude land acquisition and project management costs, but I think that the solution to the concerns about, especially land acquisition, ballooning, eating up the whole trip funding, or, not allowing for actual concrete to get poured. I think that really careful crafting of our plan is the solution to that, and making sure that the board is involved in that, in the creation of that plan. I think that'll be helpful.
Now, you mixed in project management costs, and I think there was some concern on that one. is everybody okay with land acquisition on a case by case basis?
I think it's probably silent on land acquisition because it's a given. We're a transportation agency and what you acquire land.
Yeah, sometimes you need to acquire
Mobility.
land.
Every
to
project, every
create
road to get
infrastructure.
here today that we all drove on, somebody had to acquire that. Every rail line had to be acquired. Every bus stop had to be acquired. I mean, I think it's like silent because it's obvious that land acquisition is part of mobility projects. So if we want to articulate, I think we would articulate it. I personally am not for project management costs. I would rather this be spent on true infrastructure, and the entities that are wanting it, they need to eat that. And we're gonna here to help with the actual mobility. That's just me.
I'm aligned with you on that as well. I'm not sure if everybody else is.
I can agree with that as well.
Well, and to your point, I think maybe what, do we even really need to change the policy?
I think
Or
there's a lot of
maybe
proposed
all.
changes on here, which is unnecessary. I think
Yeah,
they're
so-
trying to be doubling the reporting periods and all this stuff. I mean, I think this is a little much. I think we're trying to fix something that may not be broken.
Well, I do like the, I don't, if you go back to the thing about the 15%. I don't agree with giving the board the authority to change that year to year. I think it needs to remain the way it is. And that should be codified. Cities do these kinds of things all the time. I know Highland Village, we have a set amount of our budget every year that we allocate towards donations to charitable outfits. And that percentage doesn't change from year to year. So I don't think there's any reason why we should be able to one year say 5%, next year say 15%, and the following year say 2%. It needs to be 15%. We do our budget every year to accommodate that. I do like the idea of an evergreen policy where we have the flexibility from year to year on a few things. And I think those are the only points that I had.
Well, I would disagree wholeheartedly. And I love you, Dan. I think personally, I think the mindset should be that we have a spirit of sharing with the cities, but we also have an agency to run here, and that if we had a crash and there was sales tax revenues went down and we could barely keep our agency open, I don't know if we're going to be
But we have
building sidewalks
as a
for
voting,
cities.
as a
I think
voting
there's-
body, we have the ability, if the market crashed, we could come back and say, hey, look, this is a cataclysmic event. We've got to
No,
make
you
some
just said
dramatic changes.
codify it to where it's locked in, is what you
But
just said.
policies can always be changed.
Okay, so.
Well, I'll throw in what I'm thinking, and since we're all talking about the policy, I'm where I was kind of going with this, because I was looking at our budget for the next 5 years. I looked at, and I couldn't find anything on the A-train expansion. There's no money set aside for that. And I know,
For the what?
the A-train expansion.
Yeah.
And we're talking, if we're gonna go to 15-minute headway, we want to go to Carrollton, that's $100+ million price tag, maybe 100, yeah. So and we're gonna need, we hope to get federal FTA money, but even FTA money comes with some type of a 10 or 20% match of some sort, right? So where I was going with this, knowing that we're gonna set, we already have the policy. We're already gonna provide another 5.5 million next year. And the cities are still burning through that amount. I was in the position of, hey, in 2026, let's just suspend the policy. Let's take that 5 million that was shown in there. Let's move that to the A train. And so we start building up a kitty for that. I'd like for us to build up the kitty for that. And then let's reassess it after that. The next year we reassess it. Do we need to add more to the A train kitty? Because that's gonna benefit all the 3-member cities. So that's just my thoughts.
Well, I'm a little less in favor of that. I'm more to Dan's, just as person, I'm more to Dan's, like we need to plan that and budget that, but I don't want us to be bound to that in the event that, I mean, I think it's in the event that there's something happens, I think we need to be able to adjust that and keep more money in-house. You know what I'm saying? That's, but I think it needs to. And what's the question about the evergreen policy? Would you define that?
So
I mean, I know what evergreen policies are. You saying this does not have a timeline? It could just be annually or adjusted as needed?
meaning,
Annually?
meaning the board would not revisit this in another 5 years or another date certain. The board would, it would be the policy and the board would revisit it if the board
As
decided.
necessary.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And to your point, in a cataclysmic event, we have to revisit the policy. We
I
have the
agree.
ability.
Yeah.
That's why I see there's no risk in making it 15% and putting that in the policy. If things hit the fan, we can revisit it and say, okay, that's not realistic right now.
I agree. And I think that I agree that we have a responsibility to not jerk around our partners at the
Yeah.
city. And there's just too much, I feel like there's too much. It's a minefield to talk about, oh, well, we're gonna reduce it this year because I think that we might need it in out years, but we don't have any kind of hard numbers. And I understand that, you know, we're in a state of transformation, and we're constantly gathering information and constantly updating our long-range financial plans. But I don't think that that's a good reason to excuse ourselves from the responsibility of doing our best to plan accurately in the future. I think that I agree that we should have a fixed percentage.
Other thoughts?
Mr. Chair, I do have one, and by way of explanation, as you saw on here, Highland Village has only spent 20% of its allocation so far. The first project was the Highland Village Road sidewalk, which was a great project. It connected FM 407 all the way to Interstate 35. Then thereon, you can go on to the train station. So it was a great project. Right after that, we started updating our hike and bike trail master plan. And we have completed that, and our intent is to hopefully use the TRIP funds and other city funds as a match for other grant funds. So if we can turn our $1.5 million into $10 million worth of projects, we want to do that. So from our perspective, we don't want to get to a point where that money's taken back. Now, we understand if we apply for grants in a couple of years, we don't get a grant, we need to go ahead and make some arrangements to spend that money. But we certainly don't want to do anything when we're actively pursuing grants to lose the TRIP funds that we have.
Good point. And I think as far as this current policy is, and the next year, I'm of the opinion that once the money is authorized, we put in our budget, the agency should make good and allow the cities to have that. I do agree that because of accounting purposes, the city should spend it down. Probably, we should put some type of a time period. I'm not sure if that's 2 or 3 years after the policy, after 2025, and we say, you know, the city should spend that money down just because it creates additional work from our accounting staff to maintain the funds, to keep up with all that. I
To be
agree
fair,
with
they
that.
are spending the funds. They just haven't.
Haven't asked for it. And once that message gets back to the staff, they probably will. They can rectify that, you know, fairly
I
quickly.
do like the idea of getting to a place where
But
oldest funds are spent first.
We're currently
think we
doing
kinda
that.
do that
Yeah,
already.
I do like that. I think
Right.
that we should continue that.
so I do want to make one other point to, you know, we've been talking about we should maintain the policy. The long range plans show we can't maintain 15% indefinitely. It shows that after 3-4 years, we can't do that. So that's why
3 or 4 years, we come back and revisit it.
Hmm?
We'll revisit it.
Well,
15%.
Talking about 50% of what?
Well,
10%.
okay, so what I'm talking about is we calculate how much money based on the policy of 15%. And Sherelle's done that for the out years.
Yeah.
And she shows based on the increasing amount of maintenance for our bus fleet, the increasing amount of maintenance for our rail fleet, we can't continue operating the agency and we'll go negative.
But 15% of zero is zero.
Right, exactly.
15% again was a number that a previous board came up with. There's no magic to that. There was, and again, it was not intended to be forever. We didn't create this as a forever policy for all our member cities that somehow they are budgeting for this forever. No, they're not.
No policy is forever.
Yeah, but it was never, even when I was here, when we did this, it was never that intent that this was something we did for 5 years and we relook at it. And the 15% was just a number that we.
Well, whatever number, if you say, okay, let's make it 12%, well, that number is just,
It is.
it's just a number. So, I mean.
It is, so I'm just want to make sure that.
I think I wasn't privy to those am I on? I wasn't privy to those conversations, but I almost think it's kind of like a profit sharing. And there's years where you don't have a profit. And so maybe there's no profit sharing because we don't have a profit.
Right.
So
Right.
So if there's years of surplus, we wanted to rebate that back and everything, that is fine. I think we should try to have a goal to be profitable to where you could share that with our partners. I think that's should be the spirit and the intent of it. But there may be a year where due to a large capital purchase or a fleet, or we're rolling out of maintenance still, we may not, it might be a lean year.
Well,
but so if it is a lean year, really the current policy is that we set aside 15%. But if we're doing our budgeting and we see some of these things coming, we already have an avenue to throttle that down to that available fund balance down to nothing. So within the current policy of what we have, if we don't change it, we still have the discretion through the budget process to throttle that down to a smaller number.
I'll invite Cheryl back up here. It's calculated based on the unobligated fund balance. Every year as we go through the financial planning process, we're working on our long-range financial plan. It is true that by the end of the decade, the calculation goes to zero based on what's out there. As we add requirements, including the TOD investment, including the A-Train investment, it may get to zero faster. So Cheryl,
That's exactly where
Right,
I
so
was headed.
we're building reserves for that, right?
So a couple of pieces of information, my role in all of this is to make sure that you have the data to help make sound decisions. So from a budgetary perspective, every year we come together, we talk about operating budget, we talk about the capital budget. That capital budget is the mechanism, or one of the things that reduces the available balance from a trip perspective. What we talked about in our recent budget cycle is that during that long-range financial plan component of the budget cycle, we talked about and we showed that that trip number is included in there. It zeroes out in the year 2030. And the reason for that is because as we have gotten more sophisticated and looking at what are these fleet purchases, what are these other larger capital purchases, those items are subtracting from the available balance for any given year, okay? The other component to bear in mind is that that long-range plan does not take into consideration some very significant numbers that we are currently developing. A-Train, building, the TOD headquarters, et cetera. Those things right now, the numbers are being developed and being factored in. So this is, we can continue to base this calculation on 15% or something else, but every bit that is being expended towards trip does not enable us to do some of these. Money is money. It can't be spent twice. So, those are pieces of information that may help to think through some of the changes that will be coming to the long-range financial plan as we have more tighter numbers for some of those significant things.
one thing that occurred to me that then maybe I'm getting too nervous about something that may not be a problem, maybe that as you put in the cost for the A-Train and for the station, it may be we just don't have any unobligated funds to
That's my
provide
point.
for trip. So yeah,
That's my point.
that's that. So then the budget may take care of itself.
Mhm.
Okay. This is a good discussion.
Thank you, Shirley.
So, I also had, a couple of comments. One is the number of years that we were talking. I don't have a problem putting a time frame on how long it is that you have to spend it. I think I saw somewhere in here that there was, one was 3 years to obligate, right? 3 years?
To execute.
Yeah, so I mean, now I can't keep it, I have to go back and look. I don't like it, this 3, 2, that's gonna get so confusing. I would prefer to just say it's 3 here and 3 here.
Okay.
And just so it's
And
easy
that
and
aligns with what
clean.
the chair said, so.
And also understanding that, some of, we're not requiring shovel-ready projects, so some of these things do take time just to get there. And then, I don't have an issue so much with the idea that the eligible projects need to be, in alignment with the city's plan and with DCTA's plans, long-range plans. But the project itself, I don't want to say the project has to exist within the current planning documents, because that is a little more granular and more restrictive. I think as long as the project fits the goals and priorities that are set in those documents, I feel better about that.
Question about that. So I know that in part, this idea of having the 2 plans that have to line up was based on the city of Denton and the fact that the city of Denton has a really robust sidewalk mobility plan. Do our other member cities have already existing plans of that kind that they can just pull out of their pocket? Or are we going to be putting an unfunded mandate, I guess, on our member cities to create detailed plans that they don't already have?
Yeah, from what I've seen in the reviews that we did in preparation for the January strategic workshop, all of the cities have plans that have transit supported projects clearly articulated. And it's really going to be, the work to be done is on DCTA's side to adopt some interim long range plan that recognizes those projects that are most helpful.
I just don't want to create something that's a rigid rule that says, no, we can't do it because it's not listed in this plan and this plan.
Understood. Okay.
One thing I do want to reiterate, I understand Kristen's point about just having the money sitting there, not spending it. But again, from our perspective, we probably won't be able to apply for a grant for another 1.5 or 2 years. And our intent is to be able to use those funds at that point. Even when we get the grant, by the time you get through the process, if it's a TxDOT grant, let's say a year or more. I don't want us to lose that money during that time. If we are pursuing an avenue to spend those funds, I want to make sure we have that flexibility.
Yeah.
And are not forced to just spend it on something else that may or may not fit with us.
I second that notion, Paul, because I've been doing this 18 years and I've said, I'm either working on something that's got to be done today or it's 10 years away.
Exactly.
10.
Yeah.
Not 3, not 2, 10. And so,
I think
I don't know why there's a heartburn or a desire to get these monies expended when they're sitting in our treasury and we're earning interest income on it. I don't know what, we're not giving it to the city to not spend. It's stay in our treasury.
until
Yes,
until
It
they
should have interest earnings on it. Okay, so what's the problem?
I think as long as it's in progress, and as long as something is being done, I think.
It's
that
not a
it's-
dormant project.
Right.
Yeah.
So lots of good feedback that we can take and cause to reflect in the plan.
Is dead horse dead?
We've got good direction. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you, sir.
thank you very much. Takes us
So
to,
we'll, really quick, so we'll bring this back to the board for a conversation and aim to have something adopted by the January timeframe, if not before, so that you all have that clarity as you go into this program of projects.
Why are we talking January or before if it doesn't expire for another year? Why does it have to be done next month?
To give the board some clarity as to what's happening beyond this program, because currently this policy says that if the board takes no action, it expires and those funds return to DCTA, and we don't want that to happen. So
and those funds return.
Expires a year
Oh,
from
and-
now.
it expires in November.
November.
So we want to give the board clarity on the projects they're going to award or authorize this coming summer.
in the summer. So I don't think it needs to be a tomorrow or next month, that kind of thing.
Yes, sir.
I mean, we got months to sleep on this. I think.
Okay. Thank you.
Discuss- Item number 5, discuss local and regional updates and legislative issues. Do we have any issues we want to talk about regionally? I don't want to talk about. There's been discussion of the transit issues. I think that's been discussed at the regional level. There's, they made a decision and that they're gonna leave. I think they had 5 items that they submitted. The most controversial one was the one about, not addressing or not pursuing reduction in funding for transit agencies, specifically for DART. And that was a very very robust discussion between member cities of DART and non-member cities, really between member cities of DART amongst themselves, trying to bring the RTC into it. The RTC kind of weighed in that they would reassess it once the results from the Transit 2.0 study was completed at the towards the end of February. Kind of left it status quo for now. That's going to continue, I think, for a little bit longer. So that's all I can recall from that. Anybody else have anything on local or regional issues? We do have a transit tour coming up in about a week, if I'm not mistaken, of our local and statewide officials that are in our system. Anybody, let me try to speak clearly. Does anyone have anything else to add? If not, that concludes item 5, information reports. They're available for you to review. We do have information report number 2. You have an upcoming solicitation for the architecture, engineering, and planning services. That's in your memo. Update on the sign fabrication installation solicitation, as well as marketing communication solicitation. Future agenda items and board member requests. Does anyone have anything that they want to bring up to staff for a future board member or agenda item?
Have we talked about, are we meeting next month?
No. The next thing we have is.
That's the next.
The next item is to remind everyone that we do not have a November meeting, and our next meeting will be December 12th.
It is December 12th because that's midway between what would be November and a December.
We consolidated. Split
the difference between the two holidays.
Yes, we consolidated November, December into one meeting on December 12th.
The annual meeting or
Strategic retreat.
board strategic workshop is at the end of January.
Okay, then the next item is reports on items of community interest. Do we have any items of community interest? Oh, Ms. Allison.
Denton's Day of the Dead Festival is this weekend. It starts tomorrow at 5 o'clock with the Pine Box Derby, and then events go all day Saturday from 11 a.m. until into the evening. Most of the action is centered around Hickory Street, and it is walking distance from the downtown Denton train station. So check it out.
Awesome. Anything else from other member cities? No,
Mr. Chairman,
county?
I had one item that I was going to share with you all. We had a really successful event in support of Denton's Halloween festivities. We did a spooky story time on the train on Saturday, October 19th. Several members of our staff supported decorating the train, reading stories to kids. We had 36 people ride that Saturday morning. It was a great time for those families and a way to highlight our A train. And so we were glad to be able to support that.
Awesome, that's great.
And then also wanted to share with you, if we could, we have a couple of, we've been working to gather DCTA rider stories. And so I wanted to share with you 2 quick two quick clips of a couple of those stories. So Aaron will get that teed up for us and we'll show you just a minute or so each.
Okay.
I chose public transportation because primarily it's affordable. I'm a college student, and so with that, I'm running on a tight budget. I've got to get on the train, I got to get to school in an affordable manner, as well as the punctuality of it. It really helps me create a routine for me to wake up in the morning, get my breakfast in, and make it to the train station so I can make it to school for my studies. I would say those are the biggest factors for why I chose public transportation and using the A train.
One more.
My name is Olivia Benakin. I work at the social work office. I get to work from the DCTA access bus. It's helpful for people with disabilities. It's a ramp that falls down and really easy for me to get on and off. I can drive because of my disability. It's just really beneficial for disabled people.
Thank you for the opportunity to share that, Mr. Chairman and Board. We are doing all that we can to highlight these stories that are the reason why we do what we do. And so thank you all for the support that it takes to deliver that.
We don't have any executive session items, so if there's anything else, we'll adjourn the meeting. It is 12:04 p.m. and we do have lunch available.